Hi, welcome to the Responsible AI podcast from fiddler.ai. My name is Anusha Sethuraman. I'm the VP of Marketing here at Fiddler, and I'm excited to host the show. This is a place where we chat about all things responsible AI. So, as we call it, it's the practice of building AI that is transparent, accountable, ethical, and reliable. And I chat with different guests with expertise in the space, including researchers, industry leaders, professors, and AI ethics experts. And if you have any questions or suggestions for speakers, please feel free to reach out to us at podcast@fiddler.ai. We also host a weekly chat on Clubhouse every Friday at noon Pacific time on Responsible AI. And we have a club on Clubhouse. It's called Responsible AI and ML. So feel free to join us there as well. Hope you enjoy the show today. All right. Well, like I said, I'm Anusha Sethuraman, VP of Marketing here at Fiddler. And today I have with me Anjana Susarla, who is the Omura-Saxena Professor in Responsible AI at Michigan State University. Anjana, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Anusha, for inviting me.
You can do a much better introduction to yourself than I did just now. So why don't you tell us a little bit more about yourself?
Yeah, so my background, I'm a professor in the Eli Broad College of Business at Michigan State University. And right now I'm sort of leading a whole slew of initiatives, both research and teaching, centered around responsible AI.
Got it. Great. So what is Responsible AI to you, Anjana?
I think there's not been one authoritative or, single definition. I think we have different aspects of it that we are talking about in news and media and so forth. So it's important to highlight that what are the different dimensions of responsible AI. It encompasses AI ethics, transparency, explainability, bias aware AI building methods that can address biases.
Mm-hmm.
All those would be part of a larger understanding of responsible AI. And I think in terms of a definition of responsible AI, there have been I think the DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Project Agency, has talked about explainable artificial intelligence, and I think PricewaterhouseCoopers
Right.
and the White House, the Science and the Office of Science and Technology Policy, they have come up with different definitions. So, I think I would not want to wade into defining and pigeonholing something into responsible AI. Rather, I would like to make the point that as so many of our decisions are increasingly automated,
Mm-hmm.
whether it's we order something through Uber Eats or we are listening to something on music on Spotify or watching some we go to Netflix or YouTube for some entertainment choices.
Mm-hmm.
All of these, we are our choices are essentially dictated by some kind of black box algorithms. And
Yeah.
that's whether in business or in daily life. There seems to be almost no distinction between we live so much of our lives, especially because of the pandemic, so much is happening online. And we are leaving all these digital traces of our moments online.
Yeah.
And the result is that there's so much algorithmic decision making in every aspect of life, whether it's a loan, that you are getting from approval from a bank or you're applying your credit card limits. There is so much automation and
Yeah.
very large scale, you
Yeah.
know, use of. And so we need to understand both sides of this.
Mm-hmm.
As a citizen, what are your rights and responsibilities? And also if you're a designer of an algorithm or a designer of a system.
So, are you saying that it's the individual's responsibility as both a citizen to understand what you're using and how it's sort of making these digital profiles for you, but also as a creator of these algorithms, you need to be aware of the responsibilities that are now with you to ensure that this algorithm is doing right by everyone. So you're saying like it's sort of like a citizen responsibility to ensure that AI is kind of responsible?
Um, I think that the main thing that concerns people like me who look at businesses and how businesses use AI is that do we have any norms,
Yeah.
whether it's accepted social norms, or do
Mm.
we have some professional bodies
Mm.
that can ensure that we use these technologies in sort of responsible manner. The question of are individuals responsible with technology is, I think it's more of an individual choice. We
Yeah.
may have some protected freedom, so that's not something that I'm necessarily thinking or engaging with those questions. So
Got it.
those are digital rights and privacy, activists, they are concerned, and people who researchers who study ethics and privacy. So to the extent that I think that where does responsible AI questions, where do they figure into business school curriculum?
Mm.
And something it can be something like I think the very well known example was from Amazon when they tried to build um, an automated tool for resume screening.
That's right. Yeah.
It's a very famous example, and
Yeah.
what happened? What happened?
Sadly famous.
Was, yeah. So it's, sort of infamous and everyone likes to quote this.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
most of the training data is they were hiring men. And so one of the biggest predictors is someone's name Jared. So
Wait, what is that? One of the biggest predictors is someone named Jared?
yeah, I think something like that. That's
Huh.
what I remember some news article now. I can't
Okay.
recall top of my head.
Interesting. I'll have to look that up. I actually don't, I did not come across that particular reference.
Yeah, it was something
Oh,
like that. So, this is also a question of I think the word AI bias has become somewhat of a loaded term. But the question is when we are using a lot of, algorithmic or automated decision making, what are the what are the responsibilities of the persons who's either designing those systems or the people who are deploying the systems from a business perspective? Because according to the law, there are already some protected provisions. You're not supposed to segment by gender, or you're not supposed to do certain
right.
things. And so, the it's easy to say that one or two protected attributes I will not use in my decision making tool, but there could be some proxy attributes. So let's say, there was a Dutch, I think, very famous case in the Netherlands. They were trying to find, design an algorithm to predict, I think, welfare fraud, to detect.
Okay.
So there was, how do we, so the system has some risk indicating factors. And then what happened when it went to the Dutch government? It went to court. The courts actually said it violates the European Convention on Human Rights. But there's a right to respect for private and family life.
Uh huh.
Essentially, what was happening is this system. It was looking as one of the predictive factors for welfare fraud was the zip code. I mean, the equivalent
Right.
of zip code,
Right.
where people live. But then, you can end up essentially discriminating against, say, minority communities because certain zip codes, the demographic profile of people is very different.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Zip
can
code has always ended up, usually ends up being a proxy for some sort of ethnicity, race. Yeah.
yeah, concentration of
Yeah.
some characteristics. So, and we're seeing that in the United States too, where you had systems that are used to predict recidivism, which is when in the criminal justice system, when someone is like say arrested or say there is something there's some infraction, so somebody has committed something,
Mm.
and of course there are different severities of those crimes. Now, question is what kind of sentencing would we give that person? This is a complex, it's a very large scale legal system where they look at a lot of conditions. One of the risks that people have to consider is that judges and people in the criminal justice system, how likely is a certain individual likely to commit crime again. That's called the recidivism.
Hmm.
Again, things like zip code used in sentencing will mean that everything else being the same, a minority person from minority community will likely get a harsher sentence.
Yeah, yeah.
Compared-
There was an article about this somewhere as well.
Yeah.
So
So these are very well-known problems.
yeah, yeah, exactly. So, but coming to some of the business projects that you've
Mhm.
worked on, and when we talked earlier, you mentioned that you worked with some businesses.
Mhm.
So, coming out of some of these more high-profile problems to the day-to-day business issues, maybe we can jump right into some of the industries you worked on and also specifically the challenges that you've seen when it
Mhm.
comes to implementing AI responsibly. Like, what is kind of stopping people from thinking about it from a responsible angle? Is it a lack of knowledge? Is it a lack of tools? Uh, there's like, especially in these big organizations, people, processes, all of that also play a big part here. So, would like to learn a little bit about that.
I think the important thing to understand is when we talk about implementation of AI, mm, there is a huge gap between what's say happening in Silicon Valley and some of the cutting edge technologies
Mhm.
versus a lot of what regular businesses are doing in terms of where they are
Yeah,
in
yeah.
the cycle of AI.
Yeah. Sometimes we're living in this bubble because we're sort of thinking about AI all the time. And so you feel like everyone is sort of, but it's not the case.
Mhm.
So yeah. What's your experience been?
Yeah, and I think my experience has been at multiple levels. Part of one of the things that I do is I work with mentoring groups of students, masters, and other students. Work with companies where we can essentially act as consultants, and we can help design a solution to our company. These are basically experiential projects that I've coached and mentored,
Mhm.
and a lot of the cases the adoption curve of AI is still extremely varied. So, some organizations are very sophisticated, some are not as sophisticated. And so, before we talk about any very, mm, you know, models that are, what should I say, we first need to make sure that, the probably 80% of projects in regular organizations would still be something where we are providing some amount of visualization, building a dashboard, toolkit.
Yeah.
So, my understanding, so I think that what I focused a lot on is explainability,
Okay.
and the second part is things like bias and fairness issues. But some of the things that we are talking about in the responsible AI space, like the frameworks,
Yeah.
uh, scaling of responsibility, which I think is one of the big challenges, even for a company like Facebook.
Scaling. Hmm.
Scaling. Because the things like content moderation, you can do some content moderation for smaller size projects, but as the number of people grow, how would your let's say your even human in the loop methods of detection of misinformation or hate speech or what have you, what I would term as algorithmic harm,
Hmm.
the problem of detecting that would grow substantially more.
Yeah.
So it's not a simple thing of, okay, I can have a human moderator and that person can. There's just too much content out there. And so I think that we need to dichotomize this thing of responsible AI. And for in a lot of industry applications, the explainability and the biases, designing bias aware systems, that I think is we see that as one of our biggest roles.
Designing bias-aware
Yeah,
systems.
bias aware systems.
How would you go about that, and how do you recommend that maybe businesses go about designing these bias-aware systems?
Well, I think there are, in the computer scientists have come up with metrics to assess, biases. So it's like these, the criteria like disparate impact that we talked
Yeah.
about.
Yeah.
So, if it's, are we like predominantly targeting like one specific community? But then there is also a bigger question, which is that one aspect is to say, I don't want to target, any community more or
Mhm.
some gender, race kind of factors. But the other thing is to say that what do you want? Do we establish a criteria for fairness? And we want to, if there's already some disproportionate burden on some communities, like there's a history of redlining, for
Yeah, yeah.
instance.
Mhm.
So, should we do something more than improve the status quo? I would say that those are more of governmental agencies, and they have to be some directives by. It's not something that individual or maybe even a company. There has to be much more.
You had an interesting article about this, right? Around this whole self-regulation. Can you
Yeah,
maybe just highlight those points that you talked about in that? There were about three principles that you mentioned of how to think about self-regulation.
yeah. So in when it comes to self-regulation, for especially, I think my point was that the technology companies. Um, Regulation of technology companies is a bit challenging. Why? Because we are dealing with enormous amounts of content that's being produced in an everyday manner. And the sheer volume, something like YouTube producing billions of videos,
Mm-hmm.
there may be one simple explanation that some people can say is, can we just break up this? It may not be feasible to, maybe we want that kind of openness. So the 3 points I would like to make about self-regulation is that the technology platforms, since they're operating without some of these gatekeepers or filters that govern the traditional sources of news and information, and they have the ability to micro target their users, that is essentially something that's, almost ripe for, creating some sort of unfortunate consequences.
Yeah, yeah.
And so one thing is to look at metrics that maybe deprioritize only engagement, but
Do you think that that's actually going to happen where, engagement is what gets them like the numbers and the ad rate, like revenue and whatnot? So do you feel
yeah,
like this is something they can actually do?
well, at least in some small ways, if there's a known piece of misinformation, they can stop at least recommending
Mm-hmm.
in
Mm-hmm.
there. So while yes, I know everything is built around engagement, but at least deprioritizing engagement doesn't mean that they actively promote. And I think some of the, as there has been more, what should I say, like there's critical scrutiny, some steps that the companies already have taken is in the direction where at least, something doesn't get into the trending news or
Mm-hmm.
it,
Mm-hmm.
it
Mm-hmm.
doesn't get amplified
Yeah.
if it's known to be hate speech or misinformation.
Mm-hmm.
So those could be one aspect. But the other is just better content labeling.
Okay.
That's where partnerships between technology companies and and researchers as well as news media. I think better labeling would help everyone, and I think that might be the case in future as we have more AI and general purpose uses. We are seeing a lot of the conversational AI.
Yeah.
It's rife with a lot of gender biased references and so on. How can we overcome that problem? Through better labeling. And how will that happen? Only if we have more, there has to be a concerted effort where there's more concerned people working with companies and,
Mm-hmm.
but I think in facial recognition,
Mm-hmm.
for example, some of the biases have been pointed out by researchers working, who've highlighted some of the issues with commercially available facial recognition sites. And the extent to which you have all these huge crowd crowdsourced data sets, labeled data sets like ImageNet, that has greatly helped advance the field of AI.
Yeah.
So I think those are the ones that I'm optimistic that in future there should be better interaction between. the stakeholders of technology and the companies,
Yeah.
the regulatory bodies themselves.
That's interesting. Let's see how it goes. I kind of want to go back and touch upon something that you mentioned earlier around your work around explainable AI
Mhm.
specifically and how this is used.
Mhm.
So, have you worked with businesses to implement XAI or give them some recommendations on why and how this is, why is this important and how to do it?
Yeah, I mean, I think we can use like frameworks like Lime and SHAP within the machine learning toolkit. So, also explainability, one part of it is when you are building a predictive model, something like a logistic regression does better in explainable terms than maybe some very black box neural network. And so highlighting those trade-offs that happens at multiple stages.
Mm-hmm.
It happens at the model development stage.
Mm-hmm.
Before model development, it happens the data collection and the how much awareness we have about what we are doing. But nowadays, I see that fortunately in the machine learning community, the people who do AI and machine learning, the researchers, there's
Yeah.
also recognition that bias can happen at multiple levels, even including the kind of the methods that we use. Maybe if you're penalizing some kinds of losses in
Yeah.
building our models,
Yeah.
then that can also introduce bias and so on. So I think there's just post model building, some kind of ex post
Yeah.
validation.
That post model building is also something that it's this is not like a software application where it's just one and done, right? You
No.
can't just throw it out there and be like, okay, yeah, it's just going to function. But it's so different when it's out there in production. How do have you seen any difference in how businesses approach software applications versus ML models, especially when they put it out into production?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things I feel is that in the software, when it comes to software development, at least people have experience with it for like 20 plus years or substantial amount of time, where maybe companies have invested a lot of resources, or maybe not now. There's a lot of outsourcing, but with the AI, we are relying so much on black box AI models.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So I actually worry about the sort of biases in systems kind of being magnified in a sense, because we are all depending on the same
Mm-hmm.
very standard AI toolkit,
Mm-hmm.
and the the practitioners, we are still sort of with the AI is like magic kind of. We have somewhat of an unreasonable faith in the effectiveness of AI, that we are not so much worried about what are the societal consequences, or how will it affect the end user.
Yeah.
So that to me is the most sobering part.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, kind of thinking to the future, right? How do you solve some of these challenges in this responsible AI implementation today? Maybe what are the technologies, or do you have a framework, or do you recommend something in what steps that folks can follow as they're building or trying to build responsible AI?
uh, Personally, I think that the industry is still in a very nascent phase.
Uh huh.
So I would be very interested in seeing which will emerge as a dominant standard. And so, it's tempting to offer some predictions.
Okay.
But to the extent that, I could make a couple of points, I would say that the the biggest use cases for responsible AI will come in the financial services sector.
Yeah, we're already starting to see that. Yeah,
We're starting to see, and it'll be much more of, then, and there has to be, I think, some amount of regulatory pressure.
100%. Yeah.
Without that, unless there are some points for doing responsible AI initiatives, or maybe let's not call it responsible AI, just some sort of a
Yeah.
explainability or transparency related. I don't see why companies, most companies are struggling with enough things. They have a lot on their plate.
Mm,
And so this may be something desirable. Everyone likes the idea of responsible AI.
mm-hmm.
But unless there are some consequences, like, banks and financial institutions in the wake of Enron and some of those earlier, they had different consulting companies needed to make certain changes in how they report. So there was this whole corporate disclosure norms and standards, and those have some teeth. There's some, enforcement. It comes in with some penalties built in. Unless you have something like that, it's not going to be a very widespread.
Yeah.
So I'm interested in seeing how, in the next 4 or 5 years,
Mm-hmm.
the enforcement norms will evolve.
Gartner has this hype cycle, and so I don't know if you've seen that, but they have responsible AI in the hype cycle now, and it's kind of climbing up. So
Mhm.
I'm guessing in the next, 5 to 10 years, it will start becoming
Yeah,
more and more the way of doing things, hopefully.
yeah.
So, just in terms of if you had to give some advice to
Mhm.
some of these folks, right? Maybe before we go there, like, do you have any specific examples where you've seen a particular implementation of responsible AI work effectively in your business experience, in your experience working with some of these businesses, or even outside of that, like in your research area?
I think I've seen enough to concern me, not so much in like my own
Okay.
research. Some of the research I do is with YouTube.
Yeah, yeah.
And so,
Mhm.
I think we've talked in a previous conversation.
Yeah, about this. Yeah.
And yeah, so, a lot of doctors actually would caution against going to YouTube at all because something like COVID, what are the, top 10 most recommended videos that get millions of views? So some doctors actually, they went and watched, and there's a pretty path-breaking article in one of the top medical journals. They watched about 200 videos and said, this is not, it's not looking very good. And so we don't, I think the part of responsible AI designing recommendation systems is, do we have some way of contextualizing information for who is searching for the information?
Yeah.
I agree that, debiasing may not be all that easy, debiasing data, and also maybe deprioritizing engagement may not be. But we could have better contextual filters rather than we just put some search term and get, you know, some random set. So I think a little bit more awareness, and we need some pressure on.
Yeah, awareness and pressure.
Yeah.
So, if you had to give, our listeners and people who are watching this, like,
Mhm.
the three most important things as teams that they can focus on when building AI solutions over the next few years, what would that be?
Yeah. Oh, before I talk about three most important, I have
Yeah,
to say that the companies in the space that have been very impressive. I think firstly Microsoft
yeah,
has done a
hmm,
fantastic job of,
yeah,
and right, likewise some of the consulting companies you're seeing like Price Waterhouse, Coopers, and others coming up
yeah,
with very nice frameworks. And the European Union is very ahead in this
yeah.
space
Hmm.
with a lot more rules and regulations and very thoughtful. And I think
I think
you're
they're coming out with some more too, right, in the next couple of months.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So this is an exciting space to the extent that some of these will become law in Europe. We might see some similar things going on in the United States. So I'll be interested. So
Yeah.
yeah, the key things about what should people be aware. I would say first is build systems that are explainable.
Yeah. Okay. Hmm.
I
That
think
makes
the
sense.
explainability is something that we need to emphasize more as a best practice. The second thing is that bias and fairness are not abstract things; they are very real consequences. Where some the a lot of state departments have, I think, use some sort of black box software
Yeah.
that is,
Mm.
closed. And people, healthcare insurance information, things like that are all basically, as a result of some decisions that maybe a lot of times not very transparent to, someone's told that, okay, your insurance coverage is expired, so you can't get this treatment, and that person has no idea what to do next. Right? So
Mm-hmm.
I think that real world impact is,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
debiasing metrics need to be much more. That's something that we can't just approach these in some sort of vacuum, but we need more legal enforcement. And I think the third thing I would say is that, you know, so far in the industry, any kind of there are companies that do audits, algorithmic audits, but just auditing just an algorithm is not going to solve the problem completely, because that's only going to we are only going to be able to verify if the algorithm is working as the designer intended. But there's, a lot more.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that we will need some kind of concerted effort by the practitioners and industry to create some of these frameworks for more like strategic, rather than the software engineering side, all the metrics for
Mm-hmm.
the development.
Mm-hmm.
The explainable AI, we need metrics that can be talked. We have to go and talk to a CFO of a company or the C-level executives,
Mm-hmm.
and we have to take away we have to look at that business or the societal. I think that's probably where it's many of the responsible AI initiatives are still probably focusing on algorithmic accountability, but what is
Okay.
needed is really some kind of a bigger picture focus.
So, can you give an example of that? Like, yes, so at the algorithm level,
Mhm.
you're when you're building algorithms, you're saying, hey, focus on ensuring that these algorithms are responsible. And then when you audit them, you're making sure that they're accountable, you're holding them accountable. So you're
Mhm.
saying at the most strategic level, like maybe think through things like, do you even need an algorithm for this? Right?
Yeah,
Can you do it in another way? So you're just saying, like, sort of get out of the tree and into the forest view and consider from whether you need an AI algorithm to then coming down to the algorithmic accountability part of it. Do you
yeah.
have any steps for that? Like, what would you recommend?
That's a great question for that I have to think about for.
Okay. Yeah. All right. No, this is great. So, just to summarize your 3 points, like build with explainability as a focus,
Mhm.
keep track of bias and fairness, and ensure that you're sort of considering as you build that your models are not showing bias or
Mhm.
unfairness. And then when you're auditing algorithms, like don't just think about algorithmic accountability, but kind of think about the big picture of starting from whether you even need an algorithm for
Mhm.
something like this. Like go to the design and stages of your AI solution to start building responsibly.
Yes, and I have an example for that part. I think
Okay.
that there is a software called Compass,
Yeah.
COMPAS. I
Yeah.
forgot what it stands for. That was the one used for all the
The recidivism.
recidivism.
Yeah.
And actually, a group of researchers, they did the study and they said that, you could just use Mechanical Turk and get crowdsourced inputs. And algorithm used something like 147 features,
Okay.
and the study actually said just two, three features are enough to predict recidivism.
Okay.
So I found it very eye opening, right? So to get to this point of do we need
Interesting.
AI at all?
So do you need like 150 features versus do you just need like maybe 5 features to
Yeah,
actually like get a good result?
exactly. And I think that those of us, and I myself, I'm also a technology person.
Yeah.
We love algorithms, we love all the complexity, but maybe real world doesn't always.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So, last question here, Anjana, like how do you think responsibly I will evolve over the next maybe 5 to 10 years? And any final thoughts you want to share with people in the space who are trying to build responsibly?
Yeah. Um, I'm very excited about some of the newer regulations coming out of Europe, and also the fact that we are seeing
Mhm.
a lot more discussion about the effects of AI on
Yeah, yeah,
society.
yeah.
In the United States, all the things on facial recognition. So IBM actually was very proactive, and other companies followed suit. And they said, we're just not even getting into this business because of the potential for misuse. And so I think that it's, at least now it's clear that these are important issues.
Yeah,
And, I'm very heartened to see companies like yours are
yeah,
coming up with right frameworks. And I think the more we see startups in this space and industry people start seeing also the importance of
yeah, yeah,
building, and I think that's and some amount of regulations as well. So there are three parts to it
yeah.
clearly.
Regulations are needed to kind of spur people to do the right thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Great. Well, I really appreciate all of your insights here, Anjana. It was great to share, and hopefully, our audience finds it useful. Thanks so much for taking the time to be with us today.
Thank you so much.